Hey guys, welcome back to another Crypt of the NecroDancer Boss Guide video. In this episode we're going to take a look at the Coral Riff boss fight. Coral Riff is yet another non-story related boss in Crypt of the NecroDancer. When players enter the room, they will see a large area filled with water, and within these waters lies a giant octopus that is holding several instruments in its tentacles. Coral Riff boss fight consists of two phases. During the first phase, each of the instruments will spawn around the player. Fortunately enough, the tentacles don't come all at once, but they come in groups of two, and players are able to predict which type of instrument is about to attack. This can be done by paying close attention to the tentacles. If there's suddenly two tentacles that have disappeared, then those tentacles are about to attack. Once the tentacles emerge from the waters, they will attack the player when standing close after a total of 2 beats. The tentacles can either attack vertically or horizontally, but never diagonally, and moreover their range is only 1 tile long, so it's not like they can attack you from a long distance. After the tentacles have executed their attack, they will get back to their starting position. From here on, the next group of tentacles is going to attack. After all of the tentacles have been defeated, or after a total of 6 waves of tentacle attacks have passed, the second phase will automatically start. The second phase basically consists of the boss approaching the player, this together with the remaining tentacles in the room. During this phase, the boss itself is the most dangerous enemy, considering he has the widest range of attack. As being mentioned previously on, the tentacles are only able to hit the player vertically or horizontally. As for the boss himself, he also moves once every 2 beats and can only move horizontally or vertically, but his attack is a total of 3 tiles wide. This means that his damage also ranges further than the tentacles and can even hit the player diagonally. Therefore, during the final phase, you want to make sure that the boss is your highest priority. As for every non-story related boss, there's multiple variants, and this includes for Coral Riff as well. This time it is a little bit different though, because the type of enemies won't change during the boss variant, so each boss variant has the same type of enemies. However, the enemies and the boss itself will get stronger for each variant, meaning fights will not only take longer, but will also be more difficult in general. As for the first one, the boss has 3 hearts, all of the tentacles have 1 heart, except for the drums they have 2 hearts. For the second zone, this means that the boss himself has 4 heart containers, and this time around not only the drums but also the horns will have 2 heart containers, and the remaining enemies will still have 1 heart container. As for the third zone, the boss himself will have 5 heart containers, and the tentacles will all have 2 heart containers, except for the keyboard ones, they still have 1 heart container. As for the final Coral Riff variant, the boss himself will have 6 heart containers, and each tentacle will have 2 heart containers. As usual, we're starting off by taking a look at the general strategies first. These type of strategies make use of certain items such as spells or bombs, and can be used by nearly every character in the game for nearly each boss variant. There's a total of 3 strategies that we're going to take a look at. First we'll take a look at the quick kill single bomb strategy. After that we'll take a look at the quick kill double bomb strategy, and finally we'll take a look at the fireball strategy. The first strategy that we're going to take a look at is the quick kill single bomb strategy. This strategy works on Coral Riff 1 and Coral Riff 2. As for Coral Riff 3 and Coral Riff 4, this strategy doesn't work because those variants are a lot stronger. A single bomb does a total of 4 damage, and the boss during the last 2 variants has more than 4 health containers, so that means a single bomb won't instantly kill him, unfortunately. As for the strategy itself, the quick kill bomb strategy is not only a very simple strategy to execute, but it's also a very reliable strategy. This strategy works 100% of the time and makes this fight incredibly easy to deal with. By using the quick kill bomb strategy, this fight can be over in seconds. The strategy works as follows. The first thing you want to do is to walk through the middle doorway. Once you enter the fight, you want to make sure to press the throw button immediately. From here on, you want to throw your weapon forward, and don't be afraid that the boss isn't in your sight, as your weapon should still hit him regardless. After throwing your weapon, the boss will teleport to a new location. This can either be on the bottom right or the bottom left of the room. From here on, you want to jump back and forward on the same spot. When jumping back and forward, pay very close attention to the boss. From the moment there's only 1 tile between yourself and the boss, make sure to place a bomb and run away. Players should always walk away from the boss in a straight line, and preferably to the opposite side of where the boss is located. For instance, if the boss spawns on your left side, you want to run away to the right side and vice versa. That is basically all there is for the quick kill single bomb strategy. Before we move on to see what characters can use this strategy, it is important to address the following two things. Unlike the previous quick kill strategies that made use of a bomb, such as in Death Meadow or in the King Konga boss fight, this time however, a throwable weapon is also required, and without a throwable weapon, this strategy cannot be executed. A throwable weapon is either a dagger or a spear. Any other weapon and this strategy simply does not work. Pretty self-explanatory, but still a good thing to mention regardless. Next to that, it should be noted that you need to be very cautious with this strategy when playing as either Coda or Monk. From the moment you throw your weapon, the last phase will start, and during the last phase the boss and every other tentacle is approaching you. Now, some tentacles are located all up in the corner, and usually they move towards the middle first, and from there on move towards the bottom. In other words, there's a high chance that one of the tentacles moves over the weapon you just threw. When you place a bomb and kill the boss, it can actually happen that the tentacle dies while standing on your weapon. This means there's no way to pick up your weapon anymore, and in most cases that means a game over. Because of this, it's highly recommended that you buy yourself a little bit more time when playing as either Coda or Monk. You want to let the tentacles come a little bit closer towards you. In the end, you don't have to place a bomb exactly in the middle. You can also back up a little bit to the left or to the right, and that depends on where the boss has spawned, to buy yourself a little bit more time and from there on execute the strategy. This way it's less likely for any tentacle to die on the position of your weapon, which means you're still able to pick it up later. That is a very important thing to take note of when playing as Monk or Coda. Let's move on to see what characters can use this strategy. Out of all characters in the game, there's going to be a total of 3 characters that cannot use this strategy. The first one is Dorian, because Dorian has no option to throw his weapon, despite the weapon being a dagger, and the reason of this is because of his boots. The throw button actually enables or disables his boots instead. So without throwing you cannot execute the strategy as we know, and therefore it does not work on Dorian. As for Eli, this strategy is also not possible. This is because Eli doesn't use a weapon, and without a weapon it's going to be pretty difficult to throw one. Finally, this strategy doesn't work for Medley either, and that is because of a golden loot. The golden loot cannot be thrown, and therefore the quick kill strategy doesn't work. Next up, we've got the quick kill double bomb strategy. As the name suggests, this strategy is done with 2 bombs and can be used for the Coral Riff 3 and the Coral Riff 4 boss fights. Remember when I mentioned that a single bomb strategy doesn't work for the Coral Riff 3 and the Coral Riff 4 boss fights? Well, that is partially true. A single bomb doesn't instantly kill the later variants. However, we can still use the previous strategy and expand it by adding another bomb. By doing so, we can also quickly eliminate the later Coral Riff boss variants. All credits for the strategy goes towards the player Spooty Biscuit. Okay, so the strategy works as follows. Firstly, you want to start off by doing the exact same thing as you did with the single bomb strategy. Enter through the middle doorway, throw your weapon, jump back and forward, and place a bomb once the boss is 1 tile away. From here on, walk away in a straight line towards the side of the room. Eventually the boss will get hit by the bomb and will teleport away. Fortunately enough, the boss doesn't teleport to a random location, but in fact to a very predictable one. The boss will always teleport to the opposite corner of the room. As for the final part of this strategy, it's simply a matter of walking up to the boss and bombing him another time. If you've been executing the steps correctly, you should still be walking in a straight line towards the edge of the room. Make sure you don't go all the way to the edge, but 1 tile prior to the edge. Once you're 1 tile removed from the edge, make 2 steps upwards, and this way you should reach the spot just before the water. On the spot you want to place a bomb, and from here on you want to walk away and do this in a straight line towards the bottom of the room. This way the boss will follow you and walk into your bomb once again. This time however he is done for good. The double bomb strategy is also a strategy which is incredibly reliable, as it works 100% of the time. As for the strategy, the same thing applies as previous time. The double bomb strategy can only be executed when the player possesses a throwable weapon, such as a dagger or a spear, and this time around it does not require 1 but 2 bombs in order for it to work. Moreover, it should be mentioned that when executing this strategy as either Monk or Coda, it is actually a lot safer than a single bomb strategy. This is because the fight itself is taking longer, and therefore most of the tentacles have already moved a bit more to the bottom of the screen, meaning there's less chance that they will die upon your weapon. This means that whenever you're playing as Coda or Monk, you can simply execute the strategy without having to worry about losing your weapon. Let's move on to see what characters can use this strategy. Out of all characters in the game, there's going to be a total of 3 characters that cannot use this strategy. These are Dorian, Eli and Melody. The reason for this is similar to what we've seen in the single bomb quick kill strategy. All of these characters are unable to throw any weapon and therefore the strategy doesn't work. Last up we've got the fireball strategy. Out of all strategies that have been explained thus far, the fireball strategy is by far the quickest and easiest one to execute. Altogether, this strategy makes this fight an absolute cakewalk. The strategy works as follows. All you have to do is to enter through the middle doorway, throw your weapon, use a fireball spell or the fireball scroll and you've got yourself a victory. Easy. Now, despite this being a very simple and straightforward strategy, there's actually a few important things to point out here. First things first, similar to what we've seen in the previous 2 quick kill strategies, is that we need a throwable weapon, such as a dagger or a spear. Without a throwable weapon, this strategy simply doesn't work. Secondly, and this is by far the most important thing to point out, is that it should be noted that players need to be very careful when using the fireball spell. The fireball spell only does a total of 3 damage. Now, when you throw your weapon at Coral Riff during the first phase, he won't take any damage from it. During his first phase he's pretty much invulnerable. This means that the fireball spell is only capable of eliminating the first Coral Riff variant. As for the other Coral Riff variants, they are stronger and they have more than 3 hurt containers, which means that a single fireball spell isn't enough to eliminate them. If you end up using the fireball spell on any other variant, the boss will simply teleport away. Given you've already thrown your weapon, this now becomes a very dangerous scenario as you have nothing to fight with. That is why you need to be very careful when using the fireball spell, as most of the time you won't be able to kill most of the variants with it. As for the fireball scroll, you shouldn't have to worry about this, as the scroll itself does a massive A+ damage and this means that the scroll is capable of destroying each and every Coral Riff boss variant without any issue. Finally, and this has nothing to do with the fireball strategy itself, you might wonder why the other spells and scrolls are left out. As we've seen with the previous bosses, it was usually a combination of spells and this time around it's only the fireball spell. This is because it's not recommended to use any other spells or scrolls during this fight. When looking at the other spells or scrolls, it's usually the earthquake or freeze ones that you will be using most of the time. As we know, the earthquake scroll can best be saved for the King Konga boss fight. As for the freeze spell or scrolls, this brings quite a big disadvantage to this fight. When using a freeze spell or scroll during the Coral Riff fight, all of the water in the room will turn into ice. This makes fighting off enemies a lot harder as you're constantly slipping through the room, not to mention that you're better off saving the freeze spell or scroll for other bosses, where they are a lot more useful. That is why you only want to use the fireball spell or scroll when it comes into this boss fight. Moving on to see what characters can use the fireball strategy. Out of all characters in the game, there's going to be a total of 3 characters that cannot use this strategy. These are Dorian, Eli and Melody, and the reason for this is similar to what we've seen in the previous 2 quick kill strategies. All of these characters are unable to throw a weapon and therefore the strategy doesn't work. Next up we've got the low percent strategies. In this category we will take a look at each boss variant and see how we can approach these fights the best way possible without using any items. Before we start, it needs to be addressed that this time around it's going to be a little bit different than the previous times. You see, as for Death Metal and King Konga, there's a lot of variety between the variants. Each variant brings new enemies to the fight and every variant plays a lot different from another. As for Coral Riff, this is not the case. In the end, the type of enemies will always stay the same. Sure, they might get stronger over time, but they are still the same enemies. This means that the difference between the variants isn't as big as we've seen previously on, and in all honesty, most of the Coral Riff variants play very similar to each other. Because of this, it is quite overkill to cover each boss variant individually, otherwise we're going to have a lot of repetition and other unnecessary things, so therefore we're going to approach things a little bit different this time. Instead of covering each boss variant individually, this time we're going to cover the variants in groups. 2 groups to be precise. The first group consists of Coral Riff 1 and Coral Riff 2. Both of these variants play very similar to each other and the approach for these fights is exactly the same. The second group consists of Coral Riff 3 and Coral Riff 4. Both of these variants have stronger enemies and the approach for these fights is slightly different compared to the first group, and that is why we will cover them separately. It is time to dive into the low percent strategies. We're starting off with the first group, Coral Riff 1 and Coral Riff 2. The first two Coral Riff variants are fairly simple and shouldn't cause you too much issues when being approached the right way. Start off by entering through the middle doorway and make your way towards the middle of the room. From here on you want to jump around the room and wait for any incoming tentacles. As mentioned before, we can spot what tentacles are about to attack by paying close attention to the overall group. If suddenly one group has disappeared, then those tentacles are about to attack. From here on, it is simply a matter of going through each of the waves. The first 4 waves are the easiest ones, as during those waves you will only encounter one group of instruments at a time. As for the tentacles, the keyboard and the drums are the easiest ones to take out, as they spawn right beside you. The drums will always spawn above and below the player, and the keyboard will always spawn to the left and to the right of the player. As for the remaining 2 instruments, these are a little bit more tricky to take out. This is because the violins and the saxophones always spawn diagonally of the player. This means that unfortunately enough, you can only take out one of the 2 and not both. For most characters it is not possible to take them out both, as there's simply not enough time. When taking out the instruments, it is highly recommended to step into one of the water hazards that they left behind. This way you will create more room for yourself. The best moment to do so is straight after you killed the instruments. Make sure you only step into one water hazard each time. Definitely do not attempt to go for more than one at a time, as the next wave of enemies are coming in shortly. After 4 waves of instruments have passed, there's going to be an additional 2 waves of instruments. Unless of course you manage to take out all of the enemies in the first 4 waves, which is possible with some characters or some weapons, but for most characters during a low percent run this is usually not the case. The last 2 waves are usually a combination of several instruments. Now the good news about Coral Riff 1 and Coral Riff 2 is that for those last 2 waves there's always going to be up to a maximum of 3 instruments at a time. This gives us the opportunity to still execute the strategy in the middle of the room. If the remaining instruments would come in groups of 4, which is something we will see later on, then that's usually a better approach for the fight. Hence why we divided the later Coral Riff variants into a different group. As for the last waves, they shouldn't possess too much issues either. Whenever a wave of instruments spawns in, make sure that you hit one of the instruments and from here on prepare yourself for the next wave. Now, occasionally there might be 3 instruments spawning in. If those 3 instruments are separated from each other, this shouldn't be an issue. Simply walk up to one of the instruments and from here on prepare yourself for the next encounter. However, if the 3 instruments spawn in a group, so very close around the player, then the player should only attack one of the outside instruments. When attacking one of these instruments, make sure that you're not standing between 2 instruments at a time, otherwise you will get hit. Once the 6th wave is over, the final phase will start. The remaining tentacles in the room will chase you alongside with the boss. The boss is by far the most dangerous enemy at this point. This is because he's able to reach a lot further with his attacks, and his attacks also do more damage. Taking out the boss is very simple once you know how to do so. Basically what you want to do is to align yourself with the boss. This can either be in a horizontal or vertical line. Once you're standing in the same line, make sure you always move away from the boss at the same time as he's approaching you. Basically you want to move simultaneously with the boss into any straight direction, so if the boss moves forward, you move forward. Now for the final part, once the player and the boss move into any direction simultaneously and on a straight line, the next thing the player should do is to move back into the direction of the boss. From here on, it is simply a matter of repeating the steps. Move simultaneously with the boss into any straight direction, take a step back, repeat. By doing this you will eventually keep getting closer to the boss until you're standing right beside him. At this point you can safely attack the boss. Once the boss gets hit, he will teleport away from the player. From here on it's simply a matter of repeating those steps until the fight is over. Pretty simple once you understand how it works. Moving on to the second group, the second group that we will take a look at is the Coral Riff 3 and the Coral Riff 4 boss fight. These variants are stronger as they have more health and also deal slightly more damage. That being said, the fight itself doesn't differ much from the weaker versions. The beginning of the fight is exactly the same as previous time, although near the end we want to make some adjustments to make this fight somewhat more bearable. Start off the exact same way as the previous time, enter the room and focus on the first 4 waves first. The good news is that these first 4 waves haven't changed. Sure thing, the instruments might be stronger or have a different color, but the principle stays the same. There's always 2 instruments coming in each time, and this happens until every instrument has appeared at least once. Now for the different part of this strategy. Previously on, we stayed in the middle of the room after the 4 waves of instruments had passed. This is because in the weaker versions there's only a maximum of 3 instruments that can spawn in during the extra waves. 3 instruments isn't much of a big deal, as most of the time you can simply focus on the outside instruments. As for the stronger versions, this number increases to a total of 4 at a time. Fighting all 4 instruments in the middle of the room gets quite hectic, especially when the boss is about to approach as well. You definitely don't want to take out too many enemies at once. Fortunately enough, there's a better way to approach this fight. This is by manipulating the system. That is right, we're going to force Coral Riff to only spawn 3 tentacles for us rather than 4. Can we do that? Oh, absolutely. The way how this works is very simple. Once you deal with the 4 waves of enemies, make sure to go towards the very bottom of the screen as fast as possible. By standing near the bottom of the screen, there can only spawn up to a total of 3 instruments at a time. This is a very useful method, as this gives you a lot more breathing space during the fight. Not to mention that when standing near the bottom of the screen, there's also more distance between yourself and the boss, and that buys you more time to prepare yourself for the final phase as well. As for the remaining part of this fight, it is simply a matter of finishing off the tentacles and from there on take on the boss. As for taking out the boss, same story applies here. You want to move away from the boss simultaneously as he's approaching you, take a step back and then just keep on repeating those steps over and over again. Hit him when he's close and yeah, eventually you will win the fight. Last but definitely not least on this list are the character specific strategies and the character specific tips and tricks. As usual, we will take a look at each character in the game and see how we can approach this boss fight the best way possible. As for Aria, Bard, Cadence, Coda and Monk, the approach stays the same as what has been explained in the previous chapters. As for Bolt, the approach is completely different than the other characters. Basically, you can choose any Coral Riff variant when playing as Bolt. His strategy is very simple to execute and makes every Coral Riff fight an absolute joke. All credits to this strategy goes towards the player, Danny Johansson. Basically what you want to do as Bolt is to sit all the way in the corner. That is right, you want to sit in the corner for the entire boss fight and let every enemy come towards you. The reason that we're able to sit safely in the corner is because of the spear. Aside from certain DLC characters, Bolt is the only character in the game that starts off with a spear. The spear gives you quite an advantage when it comes down to this boss fight, as you can simply eliminate enemies from a safe distance. All you have to do is to stay on the same spot, wait until the enemies get close and from there on hit them over and over again, and yeah, just keep doing that until the fight is over. This strategy is incredibly useful and it's highly recommended that you use this strategy as often as possible when playing as Bolt. Especially when you're playing a low percent run, because that is where the strategy really shines. As for Dorian, the approach for Dorian stays the same as what has been explained in the previous chapters, although there's a few things to look out for when playing as this character. Firstly, it should be mentioned that there's both pros and cons when it comes down to this boss fight. The good news is that Dorian is capable of killing each instrument with a single hit. This is because of his wing, which gives him a damage boost. This is incredibly useful for later variants, as most of the time you won't fight off many enemies near the end. Unfortunately enough, there's also a bad side to this fight. Dorian is not able to kill any violins or saxophones during the first waves. This is because of his boots. There's no way you can reach them without turning off your boots. Definitely do not switch off your boots, as you will take damage in the process. Simply ignore the instruments that you cannot reach and take them out during the final phase of the fight. The approach for Eli is quite different from everything that has been explained thus far. That is not surprising, considering Eli plays a lot different from the rest. As for Eli, there's actually several ways you can go by. One of the easiest and safest way to get rid of most of the instruments is by kicking the bombs into the groups. When you enter the fight, you want to make sure that you enter either via the left or the right door. This way you can reach one of the groups the fastest way possible, as each group of instruments is located in the corner of the room. So if you enter the room via the left door, you want to take out the left group of instruments first, whereas if you enter the room via the right door, you want to take out the right group of instruments first. Now, the position where we want to kick our bomb from seems rather familiar. Remember the location where we placed our second bomb during the double bomb strategy? Try to get back to that location, but instead, this time around, place a bomb one tile below. From here on, kick the bomb into the group of instruments. Once that is done, make your way to the opposite side of the room and do the exact same thing, although this time the position doesn't really matter as much. You can stay a little bit towards the water if you prefer. Once both sides have been bombed, it is simply a matter of cleaning up the rest. At this point there shouldn't be too many instruments left and the fight itself should pretty much be smooth sailing. Now, if you want to go a little bit more dangerous, you can quickly eliminate the boss by executing some kind of quick kill strategy, although bear in mind that this method is a lot riskier than the previous one. Moreover, the strategy only works on Coral Riff 1 and Coral Riff 2 boss fight. As for the latter variants, it takes more than a single bomb to eliminate him, so it's going to be even more riskier. Basically you want to walk in a straight line through the middle, from here on step into the water tile will turn into a regular tile, from here on place a bomb on the tile you just created and kick the bomb into the direction of the boss. Straight after this the final phase will start. Make sure to make your way all the way to the bottom of the room and slightly to the opposite corner of where the boss is located. Once you created some distance between yourself and the boss, it is time to kick another bomb towards the boss to finish him off. Finally, the approach for melody stays the same as what has been explained in the previous chapters, although it should be noted that this time around, melody is capable of killing both the violins and the saxophones at once, rather than killing them one at a time, which is usually the case with the other characters. The reason of this is due to the golden lute. The golden lute is capable of attacking enemies in various directions, including diagonally. Rather than killing one violin or saxophone at a time, this time around you can take them out both. This also makes the Coral Riff fight a lot easier, as you won't be fighting as much enemies near the final phase. Therefore you want to make sure that you take out both the saxophones and violins when playing as melody. And that is basically all there is for the Coral Riff boss fight. Hopefully this guide was helpful and you've learned some new things along the way. Once again, if there's still a strategy that you're aware of but has not been covered in this guide yet, feel free to leave a comment down below, as not only am I curious to see what this strategy is about, but also it might help out other players who are trying to get better at this particular boss fight. Thank you guys for watching and I'll see you guys in the next episode. My name is Floriiss and I'm out. Peace.